Welcome to our explainer on a really pivotal era in European history, the period between 1648 and 1815. This wasn't just about kings and battles, not at all. This was the age that actually forged the whole idea of the modern state.
So let's dive into this. Europe was a mess, just coming out of decades of brutal religious warfare. And every ruler, big or small, was facing the same three massive questions. How do you actually get and keep power? How do you pay for everything? And how do you make sure your neighbors don't crush you? The search for those answers is what forged the modern world.
Okay, so first things first. The biggest question of all was about sovereignty. Who should actually hold the ultimate power? And out of all that chaos, two totally different models started to take shape.
Now, for most of Europe, the answer seemed pretty simple: absolutism. The whole idea was to put all the power, all of it, into the hands of one person, the monarch. They said their power came directly from God, so they didn't have to answer to anyone on earth.
But not everyone was on board with that plan. Over in England and the Dutch Republic, they went down a completely different road. They created systems where the ruler's power was actually limited by laws. Power wasn't some divine gift, it was more like a deal, a contract, between the government and the people. Now, England's journey to get there, it was anything but smooth. We're talking about a 50-year stretch of total chaos. It had a bloody civil war, they publicly executed their own king, tried out a military dictatorship that failed, and then finally had the glorious revolution that sealed the deal. Parliament, not the king, would have the final say.
So you can see this incredible contrast. In France, King Louis XIV could literally say, "L'État, c'est moi." I am the state. And he meant it. His word was law. But in England, the king was just part of the state, and he had to follow the same laws as everyone else, especially when it came to money. No new taxes without Parliament's permission.
And then you have the Dutch, who just threw out the rulebook entirely. They didn't just limit their king, they got rid of him. They created a republic run by rich merchants. And you know what? It worked. They proved you could become an economic superpower by focusing on business and trade instead of kings and glory.
All right, so you've got your political model sorted out. But that brings us to the second big question. How are you going to pay for all this? Because whether you're a king or a parliament, building a powerful state is expensive.
And you might be surprised where it all began. It wasn't in banks or factories. Nope, the foundation for all this new wealth was actually a revolution in farming that in some areas tripled the amount of food being produced.
Simple things, really, like new crop rotations and better tools meant you could grow way more food with way fewer people. And this had a huge 1-2 punch effect. First, the population exploded. And second, all those people who weren't needed on the farms anymore, they flooded into the cities, creating a brand new workforce.
So states figured out how to harness all this new energy through an idea called mercantilism. The thinking went like this: there's only a certain amount of wealth in the world, like slices of a pie. And the goal for your country was to get the biggest slice possible, which of course meant someone else had to get a smaller one. It was a total zero-sum game.
And the engine that drove this whole machine was the horrifyingly effective system of triangular trade. It was a brutal cycle. Goods from Europe went to Africa to trade for enslaved people. Those people were then forced across the Atlantic in the Middle Passage, where their labor produced raw materials like sugar and cotton that were shipped back to Europe. This system created immense wealth for the states that ran it.
All that new money paid for the answer to the third big question: survival. Because now that states were getting so powerful, Europe turned into a high-stakes, ruthless game of strategy.
After the 30 Years' War, the reasons for fighting changed. It wasn't about religion anymore, it was about national interest. And the core idea guiding everything was the balance of power. The rule was simple: no single country should ever be allowed to get so strong that it could boss everyone else around. This turned European diplomacy into a constantly shifting chessboard. Alliances were temporary. Your enemy yesterday could be your friend today. The main goal was to stop any one power, usually France under Louis XIV, from getting too big for its britches. So countries like England, Austria, and the Dutch would team up to push back.
And to play this game, you needed a real army. We're not talking about part-time feudal knights anymore. We're talking about huge, professional, state-funded standing armies. At its peak, Louis XIV's army had 400,000 soldiers. That's a staggering number, something Europe had never seen before. But this system had a really dark side, and the perfect example is Poland.
To keep the balance among the big guys, they would often just sacrifice the weaker states. Poland was a big kingdom, but it was politically weak, so its powerful neighbors, Russia, Prussia, and Austria, just decided to carve it up and divide the territory among themselves. By 1795, Poland was literally wiped off the map.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground. What's the big takeaway from all this? Why does this nearly 170-year period matter to us today?
Well, pretty much everything we think of as a modern country today, the blueprint was drawn up right here in this era. The idea of sovereign states, centralized governments with bureaucracies and tax collectors, global economic systems, and strategic diplomacy, it all comes from here.
But here's the real irony. In building these incredibly powerful centralized states, Europe's monarchs accidentally set the stage for their own biggest challenge, because a whole new way of thinking was bubbling up. We call it the Enlightenment, and it was about to question everything.
And that's the question that would change everything. States were more powerful than ever, for sure, but what happens when the very people living in those states start asking tough questions about power, rights, and freedom? Well, that's a question that would ignite revolutions all across the continent.